Good morning. I don't know if anyone else did, but I ran to church this morning. And since my sermon is about justice, I think we should do a little social justice stretch. So you can do this seated, but if you want to reach down to the grassroots and up to the sky for inspiration, stomp out injustice and move with the winds of change. And do this for a little longer because it's good on the hips. One more time, reach down to the grassroots for power. Up to the sky for inspiration. Stomp out injustice and move with the winds of change. Thank you. The reading this morning is a poem by Joy Harjo, Perhaps the World Ends Here. The world begins at the kitchen table, no matter what. We must eat to live. The gifts of earth are brought and prepared, set on the table. So it has been since creation, and it will go on. We chase chickens or dogs away from it. Babies teethe at the corners. They scrape their knees under it. It is here that children are given instructions on what it means to be human. We make men at it, we make women. At this table we gossip, recall enemies and the ghosts of lovers. Our dreams drink coffee with us as they put their arms around our children. They laugh with us at our poor falling down selves, and as we put ourselves back together again once at the table. This table has been a house in the rain, an umbrella in the sun. Wars have begun and ended at this table. It is a place to hide in the shadow of terror, a place to celebrate the terrible victory. We have given birth at this table and have prepared our parents for burial here. At this table we sing with joy, with sorrow. We pray of suffering and remorse. We give thanks. Perhaps the world will end at the kitchen table while we are laughing and crying, eating of that one last sweet bite. In the remote forest in Madagascar, there is an orchid that is somewhat star-shaped, a delicate branching of white petals called the star of the forest. She may look delicate, and one may think her name comes from her shape, but she is also the star of the forest because she grows in complete darkness. This isn't just a survival technique for her, she thrives in darkness. The orchid gets nutrients from underground fungus, does not have chlorophyll for photosynthesis, but cuts through the dirt every so often to attract pollinators, such as ants. I love reading about this orchid. I love knowing there is thriving in darkness. This orchid is a reminder for me about the ability for life to survive and thrive in unexpected places. In dark forest floors that, though may be threatened by the destruction of the earth, at least for now, host orchids. Beautiful, delicate pieces of joy, thriving orchids that live happily and healthily in the dark. I think we are all in need of the possibility that exists within these thriving orchids. In my work as a leader of the organization UU Mass Action, working alongside organizers on legislation, advocacy, and change in the areas of climate and environmental justice, indigenous justice, decarceration, immigrant and economic justice, I feel the need greatly for this possibility. In these movement spaces doing this work, I find myself standing in that awkward space of not being very hopeful, but having hope for the possibility of hope. I know that people have the capacity to do better, even when I've seen again and again that we do not always act on this capacity. When thinking about what blocks my ability to move from having hope and hope to just hope, I think about my ability to grieve. I believe that if we take time and space to grieve and be in grieving, we will have a greater capacity for joy, for delight, and we need this joy, this delight, to continue on in our movement spaces, to remember why we fight. A couple summers ago, Joni Mitchell, who's now 80 years old, made a surprise guest appearance at the Newport Jazz Festival and sang Both Sides Now with Brandi Carlile. This is a haunting, definitely sad-sounding song, and when I watched the video, I did not weep, I sobbed. I'm sure many of you have experienced songs, music, art, moments that feel that are breaking you open. I think this song, for me, both in its melody and the lyrics, about knowing life and actually realizing you don't, this moment broke me open. And the thing about moments like these, that they are not best described in sermons or in speeches, but they are best felt when heard. Do people know this song? Okay. So we're going to just sing a couple of verses. Join in if you like, or just hum along. Rows and flows of angel hair and ice cream castles in the air and feather canyons everywhere. I've looked at clouds that way, but now they only block the sun. They rain and snow on everyone. So many things I would have done, but clouds got in my way. I've looked at clouds from both sides now, from up and down, and still somehow it's cloud illusions I recall. I really don't know love at all. Thank you. Part of me was sobbing in this moment, was part due to beauty, part loving Joni Mitchell and seeing her still singing, and part of it was I just needed to cry. I was reminded of the Adrienne Maree Brown quote, "Remember, you are water, of course you leave salt trails. Of course you are crying." In a sermon about despair written in 2019, the Reverend Victoria Safford responds to the despair and grief people were feeling at the time with, "Time is not an arrow. It is not an arrow shot from the bow at the beginning, propelling history inevitably in one doomed direction. There are no straight lines in this round world, no guarantees. Seasons change and movements grow. Hearts beat on and all things like water ebb and flow. Despair can give way to resistance if you voice it in community. Grief can become resilience if you honor the weight of it and let others help you bear it. Cynicism can be melted, grim certainty unrested, apathy can wake up if the music's loud enough and strong enough. In this time of our history when violence rages on, wars begin and continue, our climate feels on edge, if not already in the midst of disaster, there is reason for despair. There is reason for despair, for grief, for cynicism, for apathy. It is one thing to talk about melting cynicism, having despair give way to resistance, but how does this all come about? How are we not consumed by despair? How do we make room for hope? How do we make room for joy and delight, the things that make our world, our survival, worthwhile and beautiful? My recipe is threefold. First, don't forget your people. Gather them, cook for them, care for them, love them in all the ways. Be gathered. Let your people gather you, cook for you, love you. Gather people around that kitchen table where Joy Harjo, the author of the poem just read, tells us life begins and ends. Gather your people, be gathered, and then let yourself cry, let yourself grieve. And finally, after being gathered, after grieving, we remind ourselves why we survive. This is the part where we dance, we eat the food we have cooked, we sing, we remember that our survival is beautiful. Do not forget your people, let yourself cry, remember why we want to survive. Often before I board a plane, I text many, many, many people. I then turn my phone off on airplane mode, and when I land, I turn it on and my phone starts dinging and fills up with texts, with messages from so many people I love. Do things like this. Remind people that you love them and open yourself to being reminded of all those that love you. Be with people and remember that no matter what, life wants life. Next, we let go of despair and let our bodies, our hearts grieve. Once the people have been gathered and fed and loved, we let the grief be felt, let the tears fall. Adrienne Maree Brown again tells us that remember, you are water. Of course you leave salt trails. Of course you are crying. Tears in themselves that are not pain, but a release of pain, a sign of the pain, a physical representation of our grief. As a leader, a minister, part of accepting grief is necessary to staying in the work, to staying connected to the world. Accepting grief is part of avoiding despair. Not only do we need to grieve, but we are grieving in the midst of so many losses and circumstances that persist and continue. We are tired of making so many decisions that are not flippant decisions, but that relate to our survival. We are tired of living through uprisings and seeing racism viciously persist. We are tired of violence building rather than diminishing. We are tired of war, of hatred being acted upon by violence, by occupation. We are tired of violence at the borders, in detention centers and prisons. We are tired of fighting for an earth that some seem to care about and others don't. We are tired. Of course we are crying. And as we gather and as we cry, let us remember that despair can be paralyzing, but grief doesn't have to be. In an article about eco-anxiety entitled, "How Can I Stay Hopeful as the World Burns?" Aisha Mirza interviews Robin Wall Kimmerer, author of the book, Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teaching of Plants. Mirza asks Kimmerer how she stays hopeful, and she says, "The grief is heartbreaking, but what I try to do is to feel that deeply. Grief can paralyze us. It can bring us to despair and hopelessness, but when we recognize that the pain we are feeling is ecological compassion, it's love for a world that is strong and fierce and says, 'Not on my watch.'" The other day, I walked out of a church after giving a similar sermon about grief. I have a daughter who is a year old, and she was at the nursery at the time I was giving my sermon. After I finished, I shook a few hands and scooped back my daughter before coming to coffee hour. I came back to the chattering, coffee-laden air holding my daughter, Simone. Someone approached me and said, "You must be much more hopeful than you let on. You brought this beautiful baby into the world." And I am. I am much more hopeful than I let on. Am I scared, grief-stricken, and angry too? Yes. But again, life wants life, and I have so much hope for this broken world. I brought life into the world because I believe that there is a great life for her to live. And so I gather my people. I let myself be gathered. I come home to a house where 2 babies live. We cook meals for each other. We sing, we say grace. We pass the babies around. We tend to the somewhat odd, weird request of the 8-year-old. We pet the dog. We sweep our floors, bake bread, and lend each other our cars. We make themed cocktails, bake cakes, and celebrate the life that is here, the life that is us. We gather, we cry, we celebrate our survival. It is no joke to feel grief deeply, especially when there is so much to grieve. But I think it helps that we know in part to grieve is to love. The last part of my recipe is to act on this love. For this part of the recipe, do what you love. Experience joy, delight, dance, sing, go see art, go to the ocean, listen to something that makes you laugh. Remind yourself of why you love your life. We are excellent at loving. Let us not let this go to waste. Our perhaps broken hearts certainly have a lot of territory to cover, but I have hope and knowledge that our hearts can cover it. I think it's going to take work, but not more than we can handle. We do not do it alone, and we do not do it in despair. To want to survive in of itself is a beautiful thing, and to want to survive in a broken world on flames is even more beautiful, and perhaps it is at its core hope. Gather your people, let your tears flow, make music that is strong enough and loud enough. In a recent conversation with an organizer, we talked about the fear we encounter when trying to organize. The fear of everything going up and already being in flames, the fear that it is already too late. We talked about how to move from this fear, leaving this place of fear so we can actually move. We talked about what it meant to move from this fear, recognizing that this move is seeing the new beginnings, of having enough hope to see the possibility that when systems, when what we saw as normal changes, when it breaks down, there is a possibility for new systems, for new ways of life, new potential, new hope. Whether or not we are able to build these systems, these communities, remains an unknown, but that possibility, the possibility that as our world shifts, there could be something better, I think needs to be felt more. But first, let us grieve. Let us grieve and accept our tears that are just a part of us, an expression of our love for life and beauty. Let us leave salt trails of tears and not despair. Let us nurture our longing to survive. Let us remember why we fight, and let us remember this by finding and creating joy, by loving the people that have gathered us. Let us cry and grieve, remembering that our pain is love, and we've always had more than enough of that. Of course you are crying. Of course we are crying. Let us let the tears flow as reminders of how deeply we are in love with the world. Let us survive because of our joy, because of our people, because we have always been good at loving. Blessed be